This is Inside the UCC Group Leadership in Action podcast with your hosts Laura Butler and Jay Maney. This podcast will share groundbreaking initiatives by the university and speak with leading educators, business leaders, and entrepreneurs that are paving the way for growth, transformation, and success.
Welcome to the UCC Leadership in Action podcast. I'm Laura Butler.
And I'm Jay Maney. Laura, here we have another fantastic episode here. And boy, what a fantastic inaugural season we had. And here we are, Laura, right from the get-go, hitting the ground running with our first guest. The credentials for James White are just off the charts. Not only is he a multiple board chair, Laura, but he's also the board chair of The Honest Company. He's a managing director of a number of other companies. He's a CEO. He's a former CEO also of Jamba Juice, the beloved brand. And he made real headways there. I believe it was through his leadership that Jamba Juice became the brand that it is today, the loved brand that it is today on a larger scale. But he's also an author. He's a speaker, sought after speaker. And today he's joining us on the UCC Leadership in Action podcast. So we're excited to have James D. White.
Jay and Laura, thanks for having me.
Yes, great to have you, James. You have managed successfully to maneuver different sectors in your career. What do you attribute the success to?
Yes, I think about, my 30-year career as an operating executive. I think the reason I've been able to navigate working in the consumer products industry, I work for brands and companies like the Coca-Cola Company. I worked at Nestle, Purina, and the Gillette Company. It really would be a couple things. One, my capacity to lead people, but more importantly, from just a personal perspective, I've always been a lifelong learner. And I think it's appropriate that we're having this discussion today. I've always been just an active learner, and I've been able to translate what I've learned in one company or one industry to another industry. So after 20 years in the consumer products industry, I moved to the supermarket industry and worked for Safeway stores in that sector. And then, finished my operating career as CEO at Jamba, which is the restaurant industry. And I've been able to translate the lessons and apply them to new industries, but also I've always been an active learner because all those industries were very different.
Tell me, your Jamba Juice journey, can you share a little bit about that? Because that's an impressive background and transitioning to some really big companies and sharing that journey with us.
Well, I think the main thing for me is just the Jamba experience was really my first time to be CEO of a company. Jamba was a publicly traded company, was incredibly challenged during the time I joined as CEO. So I really needed to galvanize the team, transform the culture, and really build the brand so that it could move towards profitability. So all the challenges that you might expect in running a company were present. And the place that I always focus is on people and leadership and really building more diverse, more inclusive cultures is a critical part of the way I lead as an executive.
Based on what you've seen, what you've experienced, what really makes a good company? And then more importantly, how important is it for them to be corporately, socially responsible?
I think the best companies, Jay, that I've worked around are companies that have a mission and a purpose. So I tend to gravitate towards companies that are more purpose-driven. So if you take the Honest Company, Jessica Alba built this company to solve a health-related issue for her newborn child. So she built a company that has clean products. So that mission is one that is significantly growing in the environment. If I think about my experience as CEO at Jamba, it was really about healthier lifestyles. Those companies with those kind of missions are going to always do better. So that's one part of the recipe. But I think importantly, the best companies have great leaders that build great cultures that are more inclusive. And the more inclusive the culture, I think it allows those companies to have and attract more talent to the organization, and they typically out-innovate the companies that they compete against. And there's a number of companies that I admire that I think do a fantastic job. Target Stores has a phenomenal CEO, and I actually talk about their CEO, Brian Cornell, in my book, and they definitely are on the leading edge in terms of being more inclusive versus some other companies.
So I've got a question for you. What leadership traits must a CEO possess if they're going to handle conflict? And right now, there's no shortage of conflict, as you and I both know. So the wrong leadership could certainly make that conflict worse, but the right leadership could be a great resolver of that conflict. But what traits must that leader bring to the table if they're going to know how to handle corporate conflict?
I think the first thing, Jay, is great leaders and leadership requires empathy. So we've all got to have a capacity, and I think this is going to be a competency that's going to be required moving forward. Great leadership has to be able to put themselves in the shoes of the people they're leading. They've got to be able to think hard about the customers they're serving. But that leadership quality is one that I think is going to need to grow into the future. So that's one point that I'd make. Great leadership requires courage. Sometimes the CEO, the leader, has to be able to stand alone on a tough issue. And the way I always thought about it is I always had my organizations live to our values. And sometimes that requires you to stand alone, to step into traffic and to make tougher calls, tougher decisions, but always align with the mission and values of the organization. And maybe a couple final points I'd make related to great leadership. Great leaders, in my opinion, are great teachers. Yes. They listen. They typically have a teachable point of view that they drive into their organization. And then the final point I'd make is the best leaders are able to get the discretionary effort from the team.
How would you say leadership courage is revealed?
I think in the toughest moments, Lauren, we've had many of those, as you both know, over the last 2 years. So if you think about the pandemic and we think about the companies that have been able to navigate and survive in this moment, those leaders were able to adapt themselves and, focus their teams. And the way it shows up is the leader, from my perspective, has to be the person that sets the context for the situation. So if you think about the pandemic, which is something we've never seen in our lifetimes, the best leaders kind of stepped into the void and were able to point their organizations down a path to really keep themselves safe, to keep the companies financially afloat, and to serve customers in a thoughtful way. The second thing the point that I'd make is they're adaptable and they move in a way that almost has them seeing around corners. So as we're headed now into potentially a global recession, those leaders are preparing their companies for those sets of challenges. In many cases, they have to do it without all the information. And that's where I think the leadership courage to really stand up and step forward is, most evidenced.
Was there any point in your career that you felt that diversity and inclusion was of short supply?
I actually believe it's always been of short supply. I think we're making progress over the last few years. But for me as a leader, I've always been a proponent of creating the space and opportunity to have more diverse teams. So I've always been a passionate champion to make sure there was space in the room and on my teams for women to lead, for people of color to play a critical role on those teams. And those have always been the best teams that drove the best results really across my career. I think the other thing that happened on a global basis is there's been a racial reckoning of sorts, kind of, driven out of the U.S., but with implications that have spanned the Caribbean and into Europe. The murder of George Floyd And
Mm-hmm.
the protests that happened related to that have kind of changed the discussion around diversity and inclusion and the requirement of that, which has really focused institutions and companies to think about the structures and processes in their companies and institutions that might disadvantage some people versus others. And I'm excited about that change. I've been excited to be a catalyst in the conversation on how to make productive change moving forward around greater inclusion and more diversity.
James, I want to dive into your book. You recently released a book with you and your daughter, Krista, Anti-Racist Leadership. I want to dive into that, but I want to hit the pause button on that question for a second, because I want to talk about risk. And you sort of brought that to light when you mentioned earlier about fear in one of your responses. So from a CEO standpoint, from a high executive directorial standpoint, I know that risk plays a factor in how decisions are made at that high level. But when is making a decision not in the best interest of a company when you factor in risk? And when is it okay to take risk on a decision that maybe others may oppose?
Yeah, I think I'd make 2 points. I think it's always appropriate as a leader to take calculated risks. What you always find yourself balancing is you want to mitigate as many risks as you can, but some places you're going to have to make a decision, and it's actually more dangerous not to make a call. So if you think about us all going through the experience with COVID, some companies and many leaders were actually paralyzed in that moment, which put their companies at great peril. The best leaders knew there was some risk to take an action or to pivot a business, but it was more risky to take no action. Or if we take the same couple-year time frame that we're looking at and look at all the social issues that have faced us, the best companies and leaders not only spoke out, but they took appropriate actions to move their companies and cultures, towards the future, which in my estimation is going to be a lot more inclusive. And I think those companies have been able to retain their people differently and are going to ultimately be the winners in the war for talent moving forward. So that's the way I would think about the management of calculated risk and really the need for leadership courage.
Can you share with our listeners what inspired you and your daughter to write your book, Anti-Racist Leadership?
I think the inspiration was driven by some projects that I was doing with a board and several companies around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I invited my daughter, Krista, who is a great researcher, brilliant writer, to join me on those projects. And we found a joint passion. And at some point we look at each other and say, this viewpoint is not present in the marketplace from a CEO, board chair around this topic of anti-racist leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And no place in the market do you have co-authors that bring multiple generations to the conversation in the way that we thought we would be able to. And thus we launched the book on that premise.
Now, I know the book provides guidelines that would help business owners develop a culture of inclusion and diversity. Can you share 2 of those guidelines that you speak about in the book?
Yeah, I think the main points that we try to emphasize with the book is that the CEO, she can't delegate the leadership of this work. So the CEO must be involved in leading this area inside the company. And then we talk a lot in the book about building empathy throughout the leadership of the organization as a core competency. And maybe the final point, you said 2, I'm going to give you 3. The middle management of any organization is really where most of us experience the company. That's the place where the leadership has to make sure that middle management of the organization has the tools and resources to effectively build a more inclusive environment inside the company.
Who would specifically benefit from reading this book? What's the intended audience as you and your daughter wrote this book?
I think for us, any leader that wants to build a better company, a better company culture, will benefit from this book. The book is written in almost a playbook like fashion. We take my 30 years of experience and bring to life real examples that I've experienced as a Black leader working inside of large and small corporations that people might benefit from. But we also interviewed 24 other executives. So we give examples from other executives and how they've grappled with this issue. So there's something there for any leader, aspiring leader, CEO, board member. So we intentionally made the book broad in terms of its reach. At the end of the day, this is a book about leadership and building great culture.
Well, I've read the book, James, and it's a phenomenal read. I think it's chock full of information. It's one of these writings that I think can change the dynamics of a company, a culture, its environment, or middle management not benefiting from reading this book. So I encourage our listeners to certainly go out and buy the book. And I imagine it's available, correct, at Amazon, in addition to any...
Yeah, the book would be available on Amazon and whatever your favorite bookseller would be, and it's available globally.
James, what's the name of the book for listeners?
The book is Anti-Racist Leadership, How to Transform Corporate Culture in a Race-Conscious World.
And I'm so happy, James, that you're contributing to a powerful legacy, because, you know, I'm a believer of reading as much as you possibly can. And as you rightly said, an ongoing learner, you know, and to always remain humble and keep our egos in check, I think is also important for strong leadership, and to make sure that you have your ears to the ground and you're really up to date with what's really happening with your team, and to make sure that you have a cohesive operation going on with all departments and making people feel included. So thank you for writing that book. As an author myself, I know it takes a lot of time and effort, but it's so important to be able to leave that for people to be able to have these resources that are so crucial to helping the ongoing development and growth process, which ultimately helps others. So thank you for that.
And thanks for having me on, and I applaud the two of you. What a wonderful platform. I know your audience will benefit with the great work that you guys are leading.
Thank you so much. And would like to wish you continued success with your book and certainly all your endeavors. And I would love for us to keep in touch, because with your level of experience, with over 30 years and the vast career path that you have had, we would love to be able to probably have you back on the show, sharing some additional guidelines and your experiences, if that's okay with you.
Anytime, please reach out.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thank you both.
Jay, that was an exciting interview, and what a lot of great guidelines James provided, and certainly to have his book out there that people can access to be able to be stronger leaders is really awesome.
And not only that, but the experience that he brings to the table, 30 years plus as a high-level CEO, turning major companies around. Now he's the board director of the Honest Company, Jessica Alba's company, really plays a lot into his respect in the industry, the credibility of the gentleman. And so we're very honored to have him spend a few minutes with us today to provide that wisdom and knowledge that he's accumulated. So we're going to keep rocking on the show, Laura. This is, again, the second season has begun. I'm excited that it's launching off with a dynamic individual as him. Yes. And we've got more coming for the rest of the season.
Absolutely. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe and focused. I'm Laura Butler.
And I'm Jay Maney. Keep in mind, you can always listen to our program, not only at your favorite podcast platform, but also here at ucc.edu. Until next time, we'll see you soon.